Like every high school kid, I didn't have a whole lot of direction and guidance of which way to go, of career or college or what I needed to do. I didn't really do the best job of being the best student, so I knew college was kind of out of the question. So I started doing some research into like vocational schools and knew I wanted to do something with my hands. And at that point, I was in a VOTech at high school. So ultimately, I decided to visit the recruiters to see if the military was the right choice for me. And ultimately, I chose the Air Force.
I joined the Air Force because I graduated from college and I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. So originally I was going to go to officer training school and get my commission. And I wanted to be this bad girl that could do great things. And I actually missed the officer qualifying test by 2 points. And so I sat down with the recruiter. I was like, all right, well, let's just go enlisted and do the enlisted thing. And left for basic training with a bunch of college debt, and off I went to basic training.
I started off as a heavy equipment mechanic. And throughout my career, I held several different positions, all the way from a contract management specialist to being on the parachute team for the Air Force. I spent 25 years in, and throughout the career, like I said, I had several job titles and positions, so kind of wore a ton of hats within those 25 years.
In my 3 years in the Air Force, I had one job and one job only, and that was a unmanned aircraft maintainer, scheduler. On paper it said one thing, but this was back in 2007 when the unmanned aircraft program had just started. So I also too wore many hats than what was on paper, and I was strictly unmanned aircraft. I loved every single second of it because I knew that if that aircraft went up in the air, at least if it came down, there was not going to be any fatalities.
First deployment was to Saudi Arabia. I was in the bombing of Khobar Towers. So that was back in '96. So came home directly after that, pretty damaged in a lot of different ways. And I was afforded the opportunity to get out at that time. So I was like, well, I don't want to get blown up anymore, so I'm going to get out. So I was out for just a little over 2 years. I was in the reserves thinking maybe I could still dabble and see if the Air Force was still right for me. And I kind of turned that leaf over and realized that, I can't hold a grudge against the enemy. I had to realize the Air Force wasn't the enemy. So a few years later, I decided to re-enlist again. And then that's where I finished out my career, throughout several other deployments. After Saudi Arabia, I was able to do a deployment to Cuba. I was in Guantanamo Bay for 6 months, where I was doing detainee ops. Also deployed to Afghanistan, and then my 1 year long deployment to Iraq.
I had one deployment to Iraq. Wasn't the best deployment, wasn't the greatest, wasn't the worst deployment, but I was the only female attached to that unit, so there were 41 other dudes that I lived with for 91 days, and that did it. That was it, unfortunately. What led me to realizing that I needed something other than pharmaceuticals from the VA and the Air Force was when I returned from my deployment. I knew something wasn't right. So what if I'm not sleeping? I worked crazy shifts, and when you're deployed, you work crazy hours. So you either are working overnights or you're up for days on end. So the sleep wasn't the issue. The nightmares became an issue. The irritability really became the issue. And then it just got to a point where I was a walking corpse. When I'd go to work, I put on a face that everything was fine. And then I finally got to a point where I quietly took myself to mental health, and I'm like, hey, I think something's wrong. And they're like, well, what happened during deployment? I was like, well, obviously there was some MST involved, and then being in a traumatic environment alone, being bombed every hour of the day, and then being the only female and being in that situation, it just knocked my noggin around a little bit too much to where it wasn't feasible for me to be deployable to continue to do my job. And my biggest thing was I wasn't going to keep the war fight down, and I wasn't going to hold the Air Force down. And so that's when they had made the decision to retire me. We actually met when we were both here. He was stationed here for a little bit, and I was on my way out, and we started playing softball together. And then one thing led to another, and throughout our careers, we would cross paths or we'd be stationed very close together, deployed at the same time together once. And yeah, we had a friendship, we sparked a friendship, and 6 years ago, we got our first date, and that was the same day you retired. The reason I wanted to reach out to get a service dog was because I had been down the rabbit hole so many times with different medications that it got to a point where I was concerned that I was going to either become an overly medicated homeless veteran, or I was going to be an overly medicated veteran with no life whatsoever and no quality of life. So we both actually discussed after the third or fourth med change in 6 months that there had to be an alternative option than just pharmaceuticals being shoved down my throat and being changed every so often because it wasn't working or getting the result that they were looking for.
So for me, I guess a lot of it was all stifled throughout my whole career because, you know, if you had something traumatic happen to you and you had to seek out any type of help of any sort, it was either frowned upon or you were looked at, you know, as potentially, I wouldn't say weak, but unfortunately, there was a stereotype that came with that, you know, a stigma. You had to be deployment ready, so you never talked about anything that you either dealt with, observed, you know, or maybe even didn't have to do with deployment. It might be something going on in your personal life, but anytime you reached out for help, it seemed like any type of mental health counseling was never available. So of course I kept that for many, many years, you know, to myself. And if you went to the doctor for anything, whether it be, you know, deployment related or just something that's happening in garrison, you know, you would not be deployable. Then again, you'd be that person that everybody looked at as, you know, we call them people stayed on profiles, or they didn't want to do the deployment. They'd find ways to get out of it. Right. So with me, it was like every other 6 months, I was getting tasked to deploy because other people in garrison couldn't. So I just stepped up to the plate, and that's where a lot of, you know, the trauma came from, was a lot of my deployments.
We're at the dinner table, we're having dinner, and he's like, oh, how'd the VA appointment go? I'm like, oh, I'm on a new drug, and they changed it up again, and I'm really worried. And he's like, oh, this is like the third or fourth time we've been through this in 6 months. I'm like, I know. I'm like, and what happens if this one doesn't work? And then they have to up it again, and then they up it again, and then I can't get out of bed, and then I can't get out of bed, and then I can't go to work, and then I can't go to work, and I lose my job, and then we lose the house, and then we're sleeping on the streets. I can't be a homeless veteran. He's like, whoa. He's like, we gotta find something else, because this isn't working. This isn't working for me, this isn't working for you, and this isn't gonna work for anybody else. So he likes to research things very thoroughly. And he was like, hey, I think I found an option. I'd like you to consider it. And I'm like, okay. And he's like, it's called K9s For Warriors. I'm like, oh boy, all right, I'm listening. And he's like, just apply. So we went online, and you filled out the online application. And then if that passes the test, then you go through a 27-page application. And then if that passes the test, then you get an in-person interview or a Zoom interview. And then if you pass that, then they start calling your references, and then you go before a board. And then about 6 months, I would say, it took for them to accept my application and accept me into the program. So I got there in actually of July 2020. And when I arrived on campus, everybody was just so welcoming and kept saying, welcome home, we're so happy you're here. If this is a brand new life for you. And of course, you're nervous, you're anxious, you have no idea what you're getting into, except you know that there's a small sliver of hope because you're gonna have a new battle buddy. You get on campus, fill out all the paperwork, do some basic training, basic classes, and then day 2 is what they call dog day. And that's when they introduce you to your dog. Now you got to go on the dog run. Mm-hmm. And I was actually out in the parking lot in front of the building, and everybody from the office comes out, everybody from the board of directors comes out, and they're all there sharing in this magical moment with you. And I was the last one to go, and all the ladies in my class that I refer to as my warrior sisters, they're all getting their dogs, and they're all crying, and they're so excited. And I'm like, oh, it's gonna be time, it's gonna be my time, it's gonna be my time. And then finally I walk out, and they have hope. This beautiful little black lab who is the social butterfly of campus. And they said, here's hope. And I was like, you and I are going to have some awesome adventures together. And you have given me hope. She's done so much. She's given me back my confidence. She's given me the ability to be a little bit more hopeful when it comes to things and optimistic. She's definitely saved my life. She's definitely saved my marriage. She's also given me the ability to be a better person that I knew I could be, but I thought that person was completely lost and gone forever.
After Ashley went through the program, I had known that like it was not only perfect for her, I was not jealous, but I was like, I thought, wow, like I could see myself in her shoes and the way she was coping with a lot of stuff that I cope with, but I end up, I shut down. That was my thing, was I'd always shut down. So I realized that I can't do that. I have to face reality. And I put in my application almost 2 years later. But anyway, I was accepted in the program as well and went to training in March of this year, and I was paired with Jude. So Jude, he's almost 2 years old right now. But when I first met him, he was he's an interesting pup because he's a golden retriever, so he likes to do his own thing sometimes. But it was, I knew eventually that him and I were going to be like the best of buds. At first, he really didn't listen to me. He had a hard time of, he knew his commands, but he didn't always want to do them the way he was supposed to. So I figured ways to work with him and find things that would motivate Jude, because you can clearly see his motivation sometimes is sleeping, and I want his life sometimes. But anyway, so we were paired in March, went through training. The people at K9s For Warriors, the trainers, the staff, everybody up there were amazing at making you feel, like Ashley said, at home, and that they were going to help you become successful, not only with your dog, but with yourself. And that's where the reality set in of it's okay to be selfish.
One of the biggest lessons I took away from K9s For Warriors, and especially being a recovering special needs teacher and having special needs sisters in the family, is, we always advocate for everybody else. We always advocate for our kids, our siblings, our animals, but we never advocate for ourselves. And if we don't advocate for ourselves, nobody else is going to advocate for us.